California's earliest inhabitants were the tribes who came down from the land bridge. They settled in California and split into several distinctive groups. Those who traveled south had found a Mediterranean-like climate and thrived in it, while those who remained in the north took advantage of the massive redwoods for canoes. The tribes were separated from the plains in the east by the Sierra Nevada mountains, and the tribes had a diet of roots, berries, and even had a special process to create a digestible mash made from acorns. It is estimated that around 300,000 Native Americans had lived in California before the Europeans even arrived on the continent. The Native Americans had experienced European diseases before they even met a European. While California was home to a large and diverse population, the story of California was much different in Europe. For the Spanish, California was just a land of fiction. Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo wrote Las Surgas de Esplandian, or The Adventures of Esplandian, in 1510, and it was published in Seville, Spain. The story was about an adventurer who traveled to an island called California, which was ruled by Queen Califia and was inhabited by Amazonian women. In 1535, Cortez led an expedition into Baja California, claiming the land for Spain. The men believed that the 760-mile-long peninsula was an island. One man believed that they may have found the island of California, but no Amazons were found. 7 years later, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed north and discovered Alta California in 1542. He was the first European to discover San Diego Bay. While Francis Drake was completing the second circumnavigation of the Earth, he landed north of San Francisco Bay. He stayed there for a small time to repair his ships, but left to continue his journey east. In 1602, Sebastian Viciano sailed as far north as Monterey. In 1775, Juan de Ayala was the first to sail into San Francisco Bay. James Cook sailed through northern California and claimed the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia for Britain. And the Spanish even considered using the bays of Monterey or San Diego as a stopping point for the galleons coming from the Philippines. Spain did not attempt to colonize Alta California until the late 1700s. The Spanish aimed to colonize its northern territory to secure its position against Russia and Britain. In 1769, San Diego became the first established Spanish settlement in Alta California. Monterey was settled a year later in 1770, San Francisco in 1776, Los Angeles in 1781, and Santa Barbara in 1786. Juan Bautista de Anza led an expedition of 300 settlers into California and broke a trail all the way to San Francisco. The trail was called El Camino Real, or the Royal Road. The Adam-Otis Treaty secured Alta California's northern border with the U.S. The colonies didn't just exist to secure California's position for Spain, but also served as missions for the Native Americans. The missionaries who colonized Alta California were known as the Padres. The missionaries were part of the Franciscan order, which was created by Saint Francis of Assisi, hence how San Francisco got its name. There were 21 missions established along El Camino Royal. The missions were established near large communities of Native Americans. The communities often fell apart from disease or famine due to European pigs eating the roots and acorns that the natives used. The survivors were forced to move to the missions or retaliated instead. The Native Americans destroyed the San Diego mission in 1775, and a presidio was built to protect the mission. Other presidios were built in Monterey, San Francisco, and Santa Barbara. It was common for Padres to commit sexual assault, enforce slavery, and baptize the natives. Over 53,000 individuals were baptized during the mission period. The newly converted were referred to as neophytes and were forced into labor. They often built structures for the missions or farmed the land. The climate in California made a great place for vineyards and orchards that were common back in Spain. Mexico had declared independence from Spain and secularized the government in 1833, which ended the California mission system. Some missions became independently ran as churches, while others sold their land to Californios. Californios were Hispanics who lived in California. The Mexican government offered land grants to Mexicans and other Latinos to move into California. A complicated relationship existed between the Californios and the Mexican government. California considered rejoining Spain or becoming independent. Small revolts even occurred during California's Mexican period. The Californios turned the land they purchased into ranchos where the cattle industry grew in California. The Native Americans at the missions either fled into the frontier or remained on their ranchos where they were used as slave labor. The beef was eaten in California or traded with the Native Americans for other foods such as maize. The beef could not be traded past that as it would spoil, so leather and beef tallow were the main exports of California. The tallow would be used to make soap, and this secured California's position in the Manila galleon trade. Alta California had excellent bays for trading, and ivory and porcelain would come from China into New Spain. Some of the goods were traded in California, and the ship would pick up California exports such as soap and continue on to Mexico and back to Asia. Fur was another export that came out of California. Russians traveled east from Siberia and into Alaska, where they hunted for pelts along the Pacific coast. Russia had established a lucrative fur industry in Alaska. The only problem was that the cold temperatures and long periods between day and night made it hard for the trappers to grow food. The Russians established Fort Ross 100 miles north of San Francisco. The fort acted as a trading hub for Russian furs and to grow food to ship back to the Alaskan colony. Russia lacked men in America to create an effective trade, so partnerships were made with American fur trappers. The Russians have a long history of fur trapping from their vast forests in Siberia and Eastern Europe. They taught the Americans trapping skills in their partnership, and these Americans began trapping in Oregon and spread south into California. Before California had their gold rush, they had their fur rush. In 1741, Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer, led a Russian expedition through the Pacific and discovered the value of the sea otter, which became a very valuable export in China. James Cook even traded for pelts when he sailed past the area. Competition grew for the aquatic mammals along the Pacific coast, and the fur rush began in 1785 and peaked in the early 19th century. San Francisco Bay became the center of the fur trade. The city of San Francisco was developed to compete with Fort Ross. Otters, beavers, foxes, and other mammals, both aquatic and non-aquatic, were common prey to the trappers. The fur trade decreased in the 19th century as the populations of the hunted species began to go extinct. The Fur Treaty of 1911 protected many of these vulnerable species and has allowed them to thrive once again. The fur rush is what attracted American settlers out west into California. After Mexico lost Texas to its majority Anglo population, the nation worried about their other northern territories vulnerable to American settlers. Land grants were typically given out to Mexican citizens, but some Americans and Europeans received land grants while others resided without one. Jedediah Smith was a mountain man and fur trapper. He traveled into California in 1826 and then went north towards Oregon. He found a route near the Great Salt Lake and opened up trade routes from Oregon into California. The Rockies and Sierra Nevadas create an almost impassable path to California. That's why these trails made by mountain men became so important to settlers. The Bartleson Bidwell Party left Missouri in 1841. They would travel west and be the first wagon-drawn settlers to make it to California. Many got separated on the journey and ended up in Idaho and Oregon, but the bulk of the settlers did arrive somewhere between Sacramento and San Francisco. But none is more tragic and horrific than the story of the Donner Party. The Donner family, along with their partner James Reed, left Illinois in 1846 to California. They arrived in Independence, Missouri by May and joined a larger wagon train. The group made it to Wyoming by July. The bulk of the settlers with the wagon had wished to take the Oregon Trail and arrive in California from the north. But the Donner Party argued that going south would save them time and miles. The party split, with 87 joining the Donner Party, and the rest made their way to Oregon. The trail guide abandoned the Donner Party, and Reed was the most knowledgeable of the trails, so he led the group. The party's journey through the Great Salt Lake Desert was twice as long as they had planned. The party lost supplies and cattle and didn't reach Nevada till September. By this time, the rest of the group, who took the better established Oregon Trail, had already made it to California. The lack of supplies and winter growing ever closer made tensions rise in the party. One argument ended with Reed stabbing another man to death, and Reed was banished from their party. The party continued into the Sierra Nevada mountains and was attacked by Paiute Indians who killed many of their remaining livestock. The party found itself stuck in the mountain in late October. Snow buried the party, and what remained of their livestock and their last source of food wandered off into the blinding snow. A small group of the party left to search for help. By the time they reached Sacramento, many of them had died, and those who had survived resorted to cannibalism. Relief expeditions were made to rescue the rest of the party in the mountains, but almost half the party had died and were eaten by the survivors. Stories like this show what Americans were willing to do just to make it to the sunny coast of California. American immigrants and Californios didn't get along very well. Many Americans believed that California shouldn't be part of Mexico, but should be part of the U.S. instead. These people came to be known as bear flaggers, and none were more famous than John C. Fremont. Fremont was from Georgia and was hired to join an expedition that would explore the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. He got a taste for exploration and adventure during his expedition. He continued to do surveys in the Pacific Northwest for some time. He traveled past the Sierra Nevada mountains and made it to Fort Sutter in modern-day Sacramento in 1844. He left on another expedition a year later, but this time he raised a militia. Other militias soon formed, and one surrounded the Mexican general Mariano Vallejo. Vallejo was confused as he actually had been a supporter of American annexation. He invited some of the men into his home to discuss the issue, but one member of the militia grew impatient and arrested Vallejo. California was declared independent of Mexico, and soon the Bear Flag came into existence. The Bear Flaggers were led by Fremont, and they experienced small skirmishes in California. Fremont even captured San Francisco, and soon found out that Mexico and the United States were at war. The California Republic was dissolved after being an independent nation for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the U.S. had just captured Monterey by landing in their port. Thanks to the Bear Flaggers, Northern California was an easy target during the war. Fremont was designated to run the battalion in California. Even Los Angeles was captured during the war. The Treaty of Cahuenga ended the war in California, but it wasn't until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War. Part of the treaty exchanged Alta California and other northern Mexican territories to the U.S. for $15 million. Fremont went on to serve as U.S. Senator and ran for president as the first Republican nominee, but was defeated by James Buchanan. Fremont also served as a general during the Civil War and was appointed to be governor of the Arizona Territory in 1878. Fremont had actually earned a fortune from the land he had owned in California where gold was found. While some made it rich, others went broke. The gold rush began with a man named John Sutter. Sutter was a broke Swiss man who left his family to try to make his way in California. He was granted land by the Mexican government in modern-day Sacramento. He established a Swiss colony and exploited labor from the local tribes to build a fort and a mill. Sutter's mill became a prime trading destination for the fur trade. In 1848, one of the employees of the mill discovered something shiny near the American River. Word quickly spread and people from all over the world migrated to California in what became known as its famous gold rush. Many invaded Sutter's land and they took the gold, which left Sutter in financial ruin once again. Many of those who got rich from the gold rush weren't the miners, but instead were the ones selling the miners' supplies. So many of the people who had moved to California in hopes to get rich from the gold ended up spending all their money on necessities like food or mining equipment. Some of the first settlers to move to California during the gold rush were called Argonauts, which were named after the Greek legend of a band of heroes who traveled through the Mediterranean. Most of those who traveled to California for the gold came by ship. The rest traveled the U.S. from coast to coast, or others came up from Mexico and other Latin American countries. Many had no plan to stay in California. They came to make their wealth and then to return home, but many ended up staying in the growing state. California's population grew 10 times during the gold rush and was made a state with the Compromise of 1850. By 1851, most surface gold was gone, and none of the miners had the money or supplies to dig underground. So corporations grew in California that could afford hydraulic mining operations. The gold rush saw people coming from all over. While most came from the United States, 20% immigrated from other countries. When the miners came to California, they became thirsty and they enjoyed the wine produced in the California vineyards. California's wine industry grew during the gold rush. Some gold seekers came from Australia and New Zealand. They loved the California wine and even brought the practice back home. Europeans came as well, but many came from China or Latin America. Non-white immigrants were treated terribly by the American miners who did not want the extra competition. China was in economic ruin from the Opium Wars and sought opportunity in California. Around 24,000 Chinese citizens moved to the U.S. during the gold rush. The Asian immigrants endured a lot of backlash from the white miners, but so did the Californios, who had been on the land longer than both. Tensions between the Californios and the immigrating whites grew during the gold rush. The population of whites outnumbered the Californios 6-1. Conflicts between the two groups became common in the 1850s, like the Los Angeles race riot of 1856. The exploding population in California also created a very unstable and lawless land. Vigilantes became common during this time for the Californios, who were referred to as bandidos.
Badges? We don't need no stinking badges. Oh, no.
The state tried to force Mexicans out of California, but Joaquin Morita resisted. Some stories portray him as a bandit who robbed miners and stagecoaches, while other accounts show him as a freedom fighter for the Mexican Americans. Even if the robbery stories were false, he was still a hero for the Californios. Crime was high in the young state, and San Quentin was actually built during the Bloody 50s to help lower the amount of criminals raiding throughout the state. The 1850s were marked by another tragic event in California's history. Many tribes were affected by diseases moving west with the settlers. 100,000 of California's Native Americans died during the gold rush. The 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians stated, "In no case shall a white man be convicted on any offense upon the testimony of an Indian." By 1873, only 30,000 remained in the state. Settlers and corporations in California used the Native American as free labor like the Californios had been doing. Conflicts between settlers and Native Americans were common in the 1850s. This became known as the California Indian Wars, or the California Genocide. It would take a whole other video to talk about every war, conflict, or massacre during this period. The conflicts ended with the General Atonement Act of 1887, which moved the tribes into reservations and established schools to re-educate the kids. While California was fighting their Indian wars, another war was brewing on the other side of the continent. Most Californians were pro-union and anti-slavery. Well, for African slavery at least. Even when segregation laws dominated the South, California had its own policies of segregation between Hispanics and whites. Most California residents at the time weren't from California. Rather, they were from southern and northern states. Small bands of Confederates and pro-union groups formed in California. These groups interacted more like gang rivalries than the full-scale war back in the East. Most of the Californians who did the fighting actually traveled back home to fight. Union troops in California entered into conflicts with Confederates in Arizona and New Mexico territories. California did contribute a lot to the war effort, as supplies of gold coming from the West helped fund the war movement in the East. Communication between the U.S. and California was difficult due to the distance and the mountains that separated the two. Information typically traveled by boat, so news would have to sail around the tip of South America and back north to California. Information from China made it to California before it did from the rest of the U.S. Information during the Civil War also spread by Pony Express. Riders would travel across the continent in a relay race style manner. The route was close to 2,000 miles and had 190 stations. It took less than 2 weeks for information to arrive. The Pony Express ended when the telegraph connected the country. The railroad also had a large impact on California. The first railroad built in California was from Sacramento to Folsom in 1854. Many dreamed of a rail line connecting California to the rest of the country to export gold and import people. The original plans for the railroad actually went through the South, but the Civil War made a change of plans. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 encouraged private ventures to build a transcontinental line. Central Pacific and Union Pacific were incentivized to build this rail. The companies were owned by a group of men known as the Big Four. They often lobbied in corrupt ways to gain more funding, and one of them was even governor of California and used public funding for their road. Many of the rail workers felt that they were underpaid and worried about the dangerous conditions. Chinese were immigrated into the U.S. by the rail company to work on the rail for much cheaper. While rail liners built in normal conditions, it was the Chinese workers who worked in the winter, in the mountains, and in areas known to have frequent attacks from local tribes. Once the dangerous rail jobs were done, the Americans were tired of the Chinese and passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which severely restricted the amount of immigrants coming into California. The first rail connected the U.S. in 1869 in Promontory, Utah. The Big Four grew rich in this process. They had a monopoly on railway lines in the West and heavily influenced the Golden State's economy. California's agricultural industry grew as food could be sent back east during the winter months. By 1880, California had 2,000 miles of railroad, and many railroad towns popped up as a result. The Big Four even began expanding into Mexico. The railroad laid the foundations for big corporations in California. The palm trees that you see line the streets in Southern California were a result of the railroads. They were installed so that settlers coming from the east came into what looked like a Mediterranean paradise. This new cultural period in California shaped the state. A neo-Mediterranean society popped up with nice weather, dry wines, and Latin architecture which resembled a Spanish landscape along the sea. A new economic boom also encouraged the growth of the California class structure, and this time people weren't in the pursuit of gold, but black gold. Native Americans have been using tar to waterproof their canoes for centuries. Small amounts of oil were known near San Francisco in the 1800s, but when Edward L. Doheny discovered oil in 1892 in Los Angeles, it kicked off the oil boom in the state. 5 years later, there were 500 wells in the LA oil field. California was the U.S.'s largest oil producer, but competed with Oklahoma in the 1930s. The California economy expanded once again for their resource of oil, but another California resource created another economic boom in the state. Film was growing in Europe during the late 19th century. The only issue was that with the technology they had, it was impossible to make a film unless it was a sunny day. Southern California experienced close to 300 days of sunlight a year, which was optimal for filming. The state also had many diverse landscapes and a large labor market. H.G. Whitley used land he purchased near Los Angeles and developed it into Hollywood land. Other film towns developed as well. Silent films were extremely popular in the 20th century. Companies such as Paramount, Warner Brothers, or Universal grew during the golden age of Hollywood. The Catholic Church also had a lot of influence over early Hollywood and censored early films. The other industries of agriculture, oil, and food encouraged many to migrate to the state. California's several economic booms each led to an influx of population. An African American community arrived to California in the 1800s to develop the city of Oakland. Another wave of migrants arrived in the early 20th century while escaping Jim Crow laws in the South. The second emergence of the KKK spread across all of the country. It was estimated that they had between 3 and 8 million members, and they attacked Hispanics, blacks, and Asians in California. The state was less affected by the Great Depression than the rest of the nation due to their diverse industry. Many sought employment in California, and the Dust Bowl in the Midwest sent a wave of Oklahomans into California, who became known as the Okies. The book Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck depicts the influx of the Okies into the state. World War II ramped up industry in California to create a fleet to destroy the Japanese. Once again, more Americans moved out west for employment. The population of California was almost 10 million by the end of the war. African Americans continued migrating to California after the war through 1970, known as the Second Great Migration. Today, many still move to California and hope to earn it big in tech and film industries. California's large population made the state quite thirsty and in search for water. Finding sources of water was an issue for the Spanish, who needed it for their crops and cattle. Most water came from the Sierra Nevada snowmelt. It became a serious issue for Californians during the gold rush. It was being used for hydraulic mining in the gold rush, and it was depleted. The cattle industry in California declined due to droughts in the state, and it eventually began projects to help preserve enough water for the state. Many dams and aqueducts were built, and all those projects increased with FDR's New Deal. Places like the Salton Sea could be an example of the future for the state. The Salton Sea resulted by a mistake made when the Colorado River overflooded into the Imperial Valley, creating the Salton Sea. The sea was a popular tourist destination, but without an inlet of water, the sea became too saline for use, which resulted in the death of their ecosystem. While water remains a large issue for California, the labor movement dominated its political scene. California had a lot of workers and a lot of jobs that needed those workers. These workers were often exploited and not treated well. Labor movements were not supported by the California government nor the state's industry leaders. Events such as the LA Times bombing showed how intense these movements became. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, highlighted the treatment of workers in the state. And pro-labor government grew during the Depression, even before FDR enacted his New Deal programs. California eventually led the way for labor movements in the U.S., but migratory workers still dealt with bad conditions in the state. Cesar Chavez was a Hispanic farmer who formed the National Farm Workers Association in the 20th century to create better wages and conditions for farmers and migratory workers coming from Mexico. California became an important factor during World War II, considering that 17% of the war industry came from California. The California industry grew during the war due to Henry J. Kaiser, who advocated for the growth of shipbuilding in the state. California's war industry had been growing since the end of the 19th century after the U.S. acquired territory in the Pacific from the Spanish-American War. The rebuilding of the Pacific Fleet was thanks to the California industry. 20% of warships made during the conflicts were constructed just in San Francisco Bay. Oil and other materials produced in California also supported the war effort. California even experienced its own battle during the war. A Japanese submarine had attacked a California oil field which caused minimal damage, but it put California citizens on high alert. A day later, reports came in of Japanese air raids and the city went into lockdown. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the Los Angeles night sky to defend the city. When the sun came up, everyone was confused to find out that no battle had happened. They knew they were firing at something in the sky, but it wasn't the Japanese. Perhaps it was aliens, but more than likely it was a weather balloon that threatened the city. Despite this, 20 Japanese Americans were arrested for the attack. The war was tough for Japanese Americans who were forced into internment camps. They were seen as a threat, and 120,000 people were victims of these camps. The war inspired a whole new style of film in California. Nationalist war films dominated the silver screen in the 1940s. While movies were making more money, so did the cost of production. Television also grew the Hollywood industry after the war. California developed a unique culture from the rise of their celebrities. Movie stars weren't the only ones in California, but the music industry grew as well. Many bands came from the state, like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who happen to be one of my favorite bands. Hip-hop and rap found a home in California, with major producers like NWA or Tupac. California was and still is a major player in the war on drugs. Some of the first legislation to criminalize marijuana was done in California, but since 2016, recreational cannabis legally exists in the state. The state is in itself a tech empire with many major companies residing in the state and its home in Silicon Valley. In recent times, California has suffered from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, with an epic rise of homelessness in cities like LA and San Francisco. If California broke away from the US, they'd have the 5th largest economy in the world, and its population is greater than the country of Canada, with the Greater Angelinos making up 5% of the entire US population. The state became the largest in population in 1962 after passing New York State. Los Angeles remains the 3rd most populous city in North America, and California may not look the same in a few years due to its long history of separation in the state. During the Civil War, Californios and Southerners wanted to create their own state of Colorado. Not actually where Colorado is nowadays, because the state was not named yet, so it was just named after the river that happened to run through California. Many proposals have popped up during the years to split the state up. Separatism is high in Northern California, where many want to form the state of Jefferson. Those living in the region don't really identify with their southern neighbors and wish to represent themselves. California has a future ahead of it. It must deal with its acts of separatism, its many natural disasters, and its ever more prevalent homeless population.